January 5, 1943. Lieutenant Red Cochran watched 4 Japanese Val dive bombers climb away from USS Helena after their bombing run near Guadalcanal, 2 miles out, too far for the 20mm guns. Standard doctrine said, "Let them go, save ammunition." But Cochran had orders to test shells that weren't supposed to exist. This is the story of how one RAF engineer's impossible radar modification turned night fighters from blind hunters into killers, and saved London from annihilation. But the modification broke every rule of physics. Experts said it couldn't be done. The components would shatter, the circuits would fail, and if it failed in combat, pilots would die. But first, you need to understand why airborne radar was supposed to be impossible in 1940. September 1940. The Blitz. German bombers destroying London nightly. 600 civilians dead in 1 week. RAF night fighters flying blind. They couldn't see the bombers. They couldn't find the bombers. 2% intercept rate. Basically useless. The problem was simple. Darkness. British pilots had eyes, German bombers had darkness, and darkness always won. Ground radar could detect incoming bombers at 60 miles, but ground controllers couldn't guide fighters to within visual range. Radio instructions were too slow. Bombers maneuvered. Fighters arrived at empty sky. The solution existed. Airborne radar. Put the radar in the fighter. Let pilots see electronically what their eyes couldn't. But airborne radar in 1940 was a disaster. The equipment weighed 600 pounds, required a dedicated operator, broke constantly from vibration, and the components were massive, couldn't fit in a fighter cockpit. Edward Taffy Bowen was 28 years old, Welsh physicist, RAF Boffin, scientific advisor attached to Fighter Command. His assignment: make airborne radar work. The problems were brutal. Vacuum tubes designed for radios sat on stable tables in warm rooms. Fighter aircraft pulled 4G turns, vibrated at 200 cycles per second. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees at altitude. Every tube shattered. Every circuit failed. Bowen's commanding officers told him to abandon the project. The Air Ministry said focus on ground radar. Other scientists said the physics wouldn't allow miniaturization. Bowen ignored them. He had one advantage. He'd seen what German bombers did to London, seen the craters, seen the bodies. He knew if night fighters stayed blind, Britain would lose. If you want to see how this impossible radar fit inside a cockpit and changed aerial warfare forever, hit that like button. It helps us share stories about the engineers who saved nations. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Bowen. October 1940. RAF Boscombe. Down testing facility. Bowen's team had rebuilt the radar from scratch, redesigned every component, replaced commercial vacuum tubes with ruggedized versions, rebuilt circuit boards, reduced weight from 600 pounds to 220 pounds. The new system was called AI Mark IV, Airborne Interception. It could detect aircraft at 3 miles, display range and bearing on a cathode ray scope, small enough to fit in a Bristol bow fighter's nose. The test pilot was John Cunningham, 23 years old, hurricane pilot, 0 night combat experience. They called him Cat's Eyes Cunningham because RAF propaganda claimed he ate carrots to see in the dark. The truth was radar, but radar was classified. So the Propaganda Bureau invented carrots. First test flight, November 12, 1940. Beaufighter with AI Mark IV radar. Target, a Wellington bomber flying practice runs over the channel. Cunningham climbed to 15,000 feet. The radar operator called out contacts, bearing Euro 30, range 3 miles. Cunningham turned. The scope showed the target closing, 2 miles, 1 mile, half a mile. Then Cunningham saw it. The Wellington silhouette against moonlit clouds. Visual contact. Radar-guided intercept. First time in history. The test controller radioed instructions: break off, return to base, test successful. But Cunningham had a different idea. If the radar worked on friendly aircraft, would it work on German bombers? November 19, 1940. Cunningham flew his first combat patrol with AI Mark IV. German bombers were hitting Birmingham, 200 aircraft. Standard night fighter tactics said fly to the target area and hope you spot an exhaust flame. Cunningham's radar operator picked up a contact at 4 miles, bearing 270, altitude 12,000 feet. Cunningham turned. The target appeared on his scope. Closing. 3 miles, 2 miles. At 1 mile, Cunningham saw engine exhaust, blue flame, a Junkers 88. He closed to 400 feet, fired a 2-second burst, 4 20mm cannons. The Junkers exploded. First radar-guided night fighter kill in history. Time from radar contact to kill, 4 minutes. Before radar, average night patrol lasted 3 hours with 0 contacts. Cunningham had found, intercepted, and destroyed an enemy bomber in 4 minutes. The numbers changed overnight. November 1940, RAF night fighters shot down 8 German bombers total. December 1940, with AI Mark IV, 22 kills. January 1941, 34 kills. The German air staff noticed. Bomber losses over Britain were increasing. They couldn't explain why. British night fighters had suddenly become effective. The Luftwaffe adjusted tactics. Bombers flew lower, faster, more evasive patterns. It didn't matter. Radar didn't care about evasion. By March 1941, Bowen's radar equipped 60 Beaufighters. Kill rate climbed to 40%. German bomber crews started refusing night missions over Britain. The Blitz ended May 11, 1941. Multiple factors. But radar-equipped night fighters made the cost unsustainable for Germany. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of Fighter Command, wrote the assessment. Without AI radar, London would have burned. The night fighters were blind until Bowen made them see. But the story doesn't end there. Bowen's radar had one critical limitation. It could detect aircraft. It couldn't tell friend from enemy. British bombers returning from raids over Germany appeared identical to German intruders on radar scopes. Night fighters couldn't distinguish. They needed a second system. The solution was IFF. Identification, friend or foe. A transponder that replied to radar interrogation with a coded signal. Bowen integrated IFF into AI Mark IV by January 1941. Now, night fighters could scan the sky, detect contacts, and identify which were German. The Germans never figured it out. They knew British night fighters had become effective. They suspected some new technology. But German intelligence assumed it was infrared detectors. They wasted resources developing infrared countermeasures that didn't work because the British weren't using infrared. They were using radar. Bowen's radar. By 1943, AI radar was standard equipment on all British night fighters, Mosquitoes, Beaufighters, even some Spitfires. American night fighters adopted the technology. P-61 Black Widows carried modified versions of British AI radar. The strategic impact was permanent. Before radar, night fighters were a defensive gesture. After radar, they became offensive weapons. RAF Bomber Command could operate at night with acceptable losses because German night fighters never achieved the same radar effectiveness. British radar engineering was 2 years ahead. And it all started with one engineer who refused to accept that vacuum tubes couldn't survive in fighter cockpits. Edward Bowen never received public recognition during the war. AI radar remained classified until 1945. He returned to civilian physics research after the war, worked on radio astronomy, died in 1991. His obituaries mentioned radar development in passing. Few people knew he'd personally designed the system that saved London. John Cunningham survived the war. 20 confirmed night kills, all radar-guided. He became a test pilot for de Havilland after the war, flew the first Comet jet airliner, died in 2002. The AI Mark IV radar is in the Imperial War Museum. Small black box, cathode ray tube. Looks primitive now. But in 1940, it was magic. And it worked because one engineer looked at impossible specifications and said, "I can do this." Bowen's radar didn't just save London. It created modern air defense. Every fighter radar today traces back to AI Mark IV. The F-22 Raptor, the Eurofighter Typhoon. The principles are the same. Detect, track, close, kill. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these forgotten stories every single day. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from. United States, UK, Australia? This community is global. You're not just a viewer. You're keeping these engineers from disappearing into silence. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Edward Taffy Bowen and the team that gave night fighters eyes don't get forgotten. These people saved nations, and you're helping their stories survive.